with the conference as it proceeds. My name is Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise, not the founder as in some of the rubrics, but I thought as a journalist it was up to us to do the punchy headlines, but we've got a really good punchy question today. Are we wasting our time? You can take that as, are we wasting our time at COP? Are we wasting our time trying to tackle climate change at all? But we'll try and focus it a little bit, because what we have here, and I will introduce our great guests as we come to them, is a wealth of knowledge about people, about consumers. So I hope that we might be able to sort of manipulate that knowledge to some sort of an answer to the question, are we wasting our time? But first, at the far end, Tony Danker, Director General at the CBI. You've been here all the way through.
Yeah.
You've warned me that you don't have a crystal ball.
Yeah.
Fair enough. But give us your sit rep sort of 3/4 of the way through, and if you don't want to predict the outcome, then at least give us an idea of what you think remains to be done.
Yeah, so the question might be, are we wasting our week, right? Because week one was, full on. It's very unlike most things. It's sort of the absolute opposite of a basketball match where, all the politicians did all the big scoring right at the start, right? So the thing started pretty big. And over the course of the last week, I thought what was really interesting was you didn't have to have 190 people agreeing about things to make progress. So deforestation, coal, whatever the issue was, to be honest, if you were a core, i.e. a big chunk of countries, you go with it, you announce it, and you hope that that snowballs over the course of the ensuing 2 weeks. Here we are at the start of the second week, and I think there are a little bit of jeopardy in the air about whether or not this week we're going to have anything like the momentum of last week, and we're going to continue to make progress, and whether or not at the end of the week we're going to be able to say we have kept 1.5 alive. So I think that is the meta question of the week. Are we wasting our week? Are we wasting our COP? Will we, come Saturday, say, you know what, 1.5 is still alive? So that's meta. I think there are some big stuff, right? Carbon pricing, what people call Article 6. I think that is big stuff. That is trying to put in place the market mechanisms that allow countries to genuinely sort of trade and converse in carbon rather than, carbon offshoring to somewhere else, yeah. Carbon leakage as they call it. That's very important, because one of the subplots of this COP, I think, has been we're starting to see the foundations of a green economy, right? And one of the most interesting stuff that happened last week, and a bit of it yesterday, is the accountancy, right? We don't normally lead with one of the most exciting things, the accountancy, but it has been. Because all of a sudden, companies are genuinely going to be held accountable for disclosing their carbon, for showing off their plans, for having it objectively measured, trying to get that to be the same the world over. That's really big news, because all of a sudden, greenwashing is not available. But to do that and not have this carbon pricing mechanism between countries, that would be only half the job. That wouldn't genuinely be a global carbon market. So that's the one I'm looking out for this week. Right. Can we make some progress on that one? Because if we do, folks sitting on these sofas can go away and genuinely engage in a green economy, in a race to net zero economy that looks exactly like the everyday economy we all know how to work.
Tony, let me just pick you up on the line, greenwashing is not available. Are you asserting that, or are you saying that that is the case provided all the so-called Article 6 negotiations deliver a structured, enforceable...
Look, so first of all, I said last week, we had a dinner with John Kerry, and I said greenwashing, in my view anyway, is now a minority sport. You don't have this many CEOs spending this much money with this many sort of executives here because they're all trying to greenwash, right? They're here because, as you will hear from these three, the change is very real now, right? It's a strategic imperative. Right? These businesses have, live or die decisions based on whether they get this right. So I think greenwashing is a minority sport anyway. But I do think that once you get disclosure right, once the markets, consumers, employees are using simple, consistent metrics about how people are doing, then there's nowhere to hide. So I think that's why it's very important. And I think this agenda actually is moving to become a CFO agenda. It's becoming genuinely about finance, reporting, risk, all those things. And that's why I think carbon pricing is important too.
Yep, agreed. And the disclosure piece is huge, and there's the sort of administrative but also really interesting technical stuff there. But let me move on quickly to Laura McMullen sitting next to me. You are the Global Head of Sustainability at Compass, which, among many other things, is feeding all of us. The bao buns were great. Shall we hear it for the bao buns?
Here. Yeah.
Thank you. But, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff here, not least the very large sample size. I mean, you're feeding a lot of people. I don't know how many tens of thousands this couple of weeks. Have you learned anything interesting from them, from just their choices?
Yeah, absolutely. So even just looking at how many potatoes we're serving every day, I think it's a ton and a half of potatoes going into our fish and chips, which is absolutely the most popular item that we've seen on the menu in the Blue Zone. And I think when it comes to the ultimately sustainability overall and 1.5 degrees and net zero, you know, the food system, the agriculture system is a huge part of that,
About a third, or more than a third of global emissions.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's interesting to see, you know, whether it's behaviourally, what are people doing with their plastic cups? Are they putting them in the cup recycling area, or actually they're putting them in the bin? You know, things like that, as well as looking at what are the popular items on the menu. You know, we're still going through there. We're sort of starting the second week, but we've got some insights, absolutely, and we've got a lot of plant-based options, a lot of vegetarian options. Actually, most of the menu is locally sourced from within Scotland as well.
So what's going down best is between veggie and non-veggie?
So we found that about 60%, it's about 60-40 split in the first week, which is quite interesting amongst the plant-based and non-plant-based. So that includes the meat dishes, but it also includes the fish and seafood and chicken and other elements, so not just the sort of hardcore red meat. And then 40%, plant-based. 60% non-plant-based, broadly at the moment.
Was you surprised by that?
I think that when you look at sort of how well informed the audience are and how you'd expect that, you know, a lot of what we can impact, or rather the food industry can absolutely impact your carbon, you know, the carbon footprint overall and what you choose to eat. And therefore this is an informed audience that can hopefully make the choices that are more carbon and climate friendly. So I think you'd have to look at sort of how it compares. You know, we've done some events before where we've had a look at a menu that was sort of pre-COVID ultimately, but pre sort of climate change or pre-climate friendly menu, and we've compared that to a much more lower carbon menu. Still taste delicious, because that's super important. You know, it needs to absolutely be tasty and at the right price point and well marketed, and we can come on to the marketing element. And we found that there's a factor of 3 difference in the carbon footprint just of those menus. So when you're looking at how is it that we can get that information to consumers to make that informed choice. So yeah, it's interesting, because you'd look at, would you expect it to be much higher? Would you expect it to be a bit lower versus sort of ordinary non-climate focused events? So absolutely some really interesting insights, and we'll see more of those coming out as well.
And has it been a winning business proposition for you to cater this event? Because you've been using EVs or hybrids to move all your stuff around. You've bin the straws and have to bring in replacements for things like plastic forks. I have a thing about the wooden forks, but we don't have to get into that. These all have costs attached, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if a high-profile event like this was a loss leader for you. Are you actually making money?
So when it comes to sustainability in the food system, I think we have a responsibility, as do other corporates in other areas, to sort of take the lead and move forward on these elements. And some of them are quite a change from before. You know, you mentioned your wooden fork versus your reusable versus your plastic.
Yeah.
You know, there's all these changes, whether that's plant-based or looking at other options, or a vegan croissant that you can get in the cafes. And I think that, you know, it's about what is the opportunity for, I guess, us as a whole to move forward in that direction. So certainly we've got not just clients, but many of our stakeholders interested, requesting this, looking at moving in this direction, you know, whether it's investors on a net zero or 1.5 degree coalition, or it's clients in the health and well-being space or the healthcare base that are also on a net zero trajectory.
Right.
You know, it's not just a sort of subset of clients. It's actually all across the board as well as employees. So there's an element of change for us being able to provide what clients and consumers want and what works well. And, you know, yes, we have to source other reusable containers, and in some cases there's a higher cost to that, but actually we have to look at it holistically of what direction of travel are we going in and how can we contribute to the solution, not be part of the problem.
Okay. Interesting. I notice you're not quite answering my question about whether you're making money on the event. Fair enough. That might be proprietary information. But reassure me on one basic point, right? Making these changes that you have to make to keep your customers and suppliers happy, is that sustainable from a business point of view?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that we have to move towards a sustainable model.
Yeah.
And there's quite a lot of different ways of doing that, whether it's looking at food waste and more circular economy, whether that's training our chefs to do more plant-based menus, whether it's using behavioural insights to educate our consumers about, or encouraging them to take more climate-friendly option. You know, there's lots of different ways for us to get involved and to look at that, but absolutely we've got to move it forward in a sustainable direction.
Okay, well, let's talk about sustainability more broadly and perhaps over a longer term. Warren Bowden, Innovation and Sustainability Director at the Scottish Leather Group, and you've been there some time. As I was warning you before we came in, we had Stella McCartney around these halls yesterday, and after one event, she mentioned the fact that she runs her fashion line animal leather free. And you're here to say, among other things, that animal leather is sustainable. Just sort of set out how that is, but also how the conversation about sustainability in your business has changed over the time you've been in it.
Thank you for the introduction. Before I do that, can I just pick on something
Of
Tony
course,
said?
yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting piece. To me, stepping back from this, not necessarily speaking on behalf of leather, but I will partially answer your question. I can't wait for the day when there is no more greenwash, whether it's voluntary or an obligation, when we as consumers can walk into a shop or whatever online and you can see the actual impact of the product on a label, whether that's captured fiscally as a carbon tax or whether that's captured in terms of a metric. Because I think then we as consumers could make informed choices. One thing I've heard throughout the last 2 weeks are these sort of grabs of this is better, that's better. How do we know those things are better? Until you can actually standardize them and then present them for offer for sale or however that works. And that also then brings me to the answer to your question. Because there's an awful lot of echo chamber noise about various parts of this whole sort of planet discussion. And some of it's relevant to the planet discussion. But when you look at the impact of plastics on the planet, it's convenient that those things are often missed.
They're often
missed.
Right.
You can present something emotionally or in some people's minds ethically, which ticks their box, which is great. But does it actually solve the planet crisis? And my argument to that is absolutely it does not. So I'll then answer the second part of your question if I can. Slightly, again, stepping back, leather is the second oldest profession. Man has been I'm not going to answer the first one. We've been upcycling, thank you. We've been upcycling hides for tens of thousands of years. Yeah? The hide is a waste or a byproduct from eating meat. Man has been farming that for tens of thousands of years, long before the climate crisis. There's a lot of rhetoric around livestock and the impact of it. Some of it's real, some of it is, again, echo chamber. What we did, coming specifically to Scottish Leather Group, and I have been there 18 years, was we started off benchmarking and said, okay, look, this is current leather production. This is the global linear manufacturing system. You take a hide, you put it in a factory, you make a product, we use it, we wear it, we throw it away. Hang on, that's not right, that's not sustainable. And we thought about it from a point of view, firstly from risk, because there's clearly a waste issue. Back in the day, we were producing and disposing 30,000 tons of waste every year, using 65 gigawatts of power. One thing that came
in
to
the
light,
UK or
in the UK,
yeah,
one thing that came to light was if you take that waste and you converted it into your own heat, you shouldn't need to use fossil fuels. So we did. Now there's a long journey. I've captured that in about 2 minutes, and there's a lot of pain and a lot of expenditure that went into that. But essentially, if you could capture your own waste, create your own heat, you don't need fossil fuels. We set a target more recently of achieving 0 in waste and 0 in terms of our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2025. I don't want to set a target after I retire. By 2025. Now, by 2025, and we're already 90% of the journey there, the last 10% always the toughest. But the change has been dramatic. We no longer have this external disposal risk that we had before. We've changed the way that we buy energy, that we do have to bring in, and we produce our own. That created an industrial epiphany. And actually, within the patent for that process, we patented the phrase low carbon leather, which is actually one of our marketing mantras. Now, what we do is not typical of the global leather sector, but it's an example of what can be done, circularizing what is already a circular manufacturing system at the beginning of the process, circularizing during manufacture, and then one more piece. Once we as consumers have bought those leather goods, what do you do with it? You throw it away. The linear manufacturing system. Only about 9% of all things that we buy end up being returned. Well, you can take back our leather to us, and we can convert that back into more heat to make more leather, and actually, and I'm going to do this because I haven't got 3 hands, but circularize the whole process.
You convert it back into more heat, not more leather. You don't no other, not into different products.
Correct. You convert it back into more leather. Sorry, convert it into heat. We can also end-of-life materials, convert end-of-life leather into, and this is really, I think, looking ahead for the next 10 years, plastic replacements. Can we convert those biomaterials that have served their primary purpose and put them into a clever bit of chemistry that can actually replace plastic? And the answer is yes.
Thank you, Warren. I want to come back to this question of standardizing information for consumers, because I think it's really important if we have a few minutes at the end. But first, let's come to Yasmin Diamond, Executive Vice President for Global Corporate Affairs at Intercontinental Hotels and Resorts, which you've got a lot of different hotels, a lot of different brands, but I think it's fair to say that your customers, broadly speaking, hundreds of thousands of them, are used to being pampered. How do you bring them along in this journey to shrink our personal, collective carbon footprints and waste generally?
Thank you, Giles, and it's great to be here. Firstly, just to give you a bit of context, we've got 6,000 hotels in over 100 countries around the world, so that's thousands and thousands of communities. And what you may not know, that we are predominantly a franchise business model, so we work with thousands of basically small to medium-sized enterprises across the globe. So that just gives you the context of the scale. As you quite rightly say, we've got a whole range of hotel brands. We did a really interesting survey earlier on this year. We interviewed over 10,000 people across the globe. Over 80% of them said they wanted to have choose accommodation and hotel stays that were sustainable and allowed them to travel responsibly. And then the really interesting fact for us, which obviously needs to convert, is over 30% of them said they would pay more. They would pay more for that stay. So you can see there that there is an appetite. And then from our big corporate clients, we know that, the big clients who stay with us, that do the big, we'll take thousands of rooms for our colleagues every year. The questions we are now being asked around this area is quite phenomenal. So our data has to be really good, and we've got some really good systems to be able to give that information back, like our Green Engage tool. So we're getting it from a number of areas. And then during COVID, what we found is we removed so much things from your hotel room, and I bet most of you probably didn't even, missed them. So, like the leaflets or the hotel directories. Well, those hotel directories cost quite a lot of money to make. They get outdated, so you have to reprint them and put them back in the hotel room. So we've done different things, like we've put them onto QR codes. We put them onto the television screens that you all have in the hotel rooms. So there's a whole range of things. We're being quite thoughtful about what we bring back. Now, your second point about the luxury end.
Yeah.
We think, and we've got quite a lot of evidence just to demonstrate that luxury and a really, really, luxury stay and a good guest satisfaction, as well as being a sustainable, go hand in hand. So I'll give you an example from Six Senses, which is our most high-level luxury brand that we have in our portfolio. It's world-renowned. It's big in resorts, going into urban locations. Their whole ethos and kind of heritage is around sustainability and wellness. And so by 2022, that brand will be plastic-free. So they're doing some really fantastic things. They're mainly in resort locations, and they're doing a lot of things around reusing energy, using water in a very, very different way, using new technologies. So there's a lot there that we see, and that brand charges £2,000 to £3,000 a night. So at that certain price point, there isn't that price sensitivity, and you do find that there's a certain group of travellers and guests that were prepared to pay for it. So some of it goes hand in hand.
Well, Yasmin, I mean, that is extraordinary. I don't think I've ever will pay that much for a hotel room. But your point earlier that the people you polled said they're willing to pay up to 30% extra for a sustainable stay. Do you believe them, and this is the tough one, but I'm going to ask it anyway because we promised to ask the tough questions. Do you believe that the people on the streets will believe it's a sustainable stay?
So two things there. We've done surveys before, Giles, where people will say we would do X, Y, and Z. We've just seen it coming through way stronger now, and we are seeing that playing through some of our brands. So a few years back, we decided to remove from every single one of our hotel bathrooms the smaller little plastic bottles that you could all take when you left on your stay, which we all did, and we replaced them with bulk amenities. It was probably one of the most popular things we did for our guests. We also look at food waste and how we can remove food waste through things like using AI, where, the gorgeous hotel buffets, we all love them. What happens to that food when we don't eat it? So at the Intercontinental in Dubai, again, a high-end hotel is using a winnow system using AI to kind of measure the food waste to then help them look at what they would produce the next time. And they've saved over 100,000 meals. So we as guests, we also want us as hotel companies to take some of that out for us so that I don't have to think about it, it just happens for me. So there's a real balance. So I do think we're seeing a real shift, but it's also imperative on us as companies and as a hotel company, how we can help the guests to have that stay where they don't have to do a whole range of things themselves.
Right. Yeah. This whole idea of businesses taking the initiative, doing stuff for consumers. Tony?
You asked me a question before we came on stage, Giles, an interesting question. You said to me, do businesses feel invited to come? I think the answer is no, not really, but we're showing up anyway. And this is why we're showing up anyway, if I may say something controversial. When it comes to where are the people in this discussion, I think politicians around the world are a bit floored by this. Because when you look at opinion polls, the opinion polls are not overwhelmingly positive about people willing to pay more and behave differently for transition. And politicians are a bit stuck in the headlights of that. They don't quite know what to do with that. I think businesses, and we've just heard 3 examples, are actually going to get this job done vis-a-vis consumer taste, consumer preference, and consumer behavior, because they're working on viable consumer solutions and answers that are greener, that are more sustainable. And they're getting to test them every day, and they're getting to test the small bits about will people eat more sustainably, dress more sustainably, travel more sustainably. And, I think this is a sort of, these are 3 isolated examples, but they are part of a broader change, I think, that's happening, which it will be the private sector that delivers green answers for green consumers, for all consumers. And whilst I think politicians are really a bit stuck by what they see as a citizenry who have mixed views, I think business anyway is going to try and make these things mainstream. Yeah. Now that, you would expect me to say that, but I think we've just heard 3 examples that it's true.
But I'd be really interested to hear from the rest of you as well on this question of whether the COP process has embraced business as much as it needs to be embraced. You're clearly, Laura, your company is intimately involved in this because you are hired to cater it. But do you have a sense of whether at the corporate leadership level you're being consulted?
I think it depends what topic you look at and what engagement you might already have at a business level. We have a lot of partnerships. We're partnered with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development.
Right.
They've released a climate manifesto. They're working on 50% regenerative agriculture by 2030. There's positive nutrition coalitions. There's a lot of involvement that I think we have in our standard channels, not necessarily specifically at COP at the negotiating table. I think that sort of tends to be more, in the country level, the government level, but absolutely in terms of other forums, because it's not just about what happens at COP. It's sort of in the lead up to that, for us and for other businesses, and then subsequently. So I'd say that whilst perhaps business is not the focus, I think that because we're part of it, and actually absolutely to your point around we're here, and we're not the primary focus. You have to look around the Blue Zone. It's very NGO-led. It's conversations at the WWF Panda Hub, at the Science Hub, with the countries looking at, what Japan are doing on hydrogen. It's all of that without the sort of big focus on business. But we're part of the conversation, hopefully, through the other channels.
But let me tell a tale out of school. I'm going to just not quite mention the name, but a very senior person at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is one of those who complained in no uncertain terms to me about this, about COP's failure to embrace business. At least you guys are here. There are forums here. There are forums across the river in the Green Zone. But, I mean, Warren, how do you feel, is it fair to characterize this process as leaning heavily on business and explicitly, John Kerry among others coming and saying we need your money, essentially, and then not acknowledging this crucial position of business between government and consumers and civil society?
I think it's completely a disconnect.
A disconnect?
A complete disconnect. Politicians, from my point of view, are setting the infrastructure, the framework, the macro scale. That's fine. One of the key issues that's not on the agenda at COP is circularity, resource efficiency on the planet. Why, for example, is a tree worth more felled than it is stood up? I don't get that. Maybe that's a deforestation initiative. But how does business implement that? The disconnect is between the two things. Circularity in our own business model is important. Whether we actually fully convert that into all areas of that business model and involving the consumer. But where's the consumer's voice in this? Maybe they're the ones walking down the street with placards, because I think they are.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a real connection between the policies that are being issued. We mentioned earlier the carbon taxation. That's going to affect business. It's those who make it that will end up paying for it.
Absolutely.
Those who take it back will end up paying for it, and the whole supply chain that goes with it. We're not going to achieve 1.5 degree until every part of a supply chain is involved in that delivery.
Warren, I need to interrupt you because before we run out of time, I want to give Yasmin another bite of the cherry. You operate in many, many countries. Name one or perhaps two that have avoided this disconnect between government and business.
I think we do work in 100 countries. There's lots of different governments that we work with. Right. And I feel as though you're genuinely seen on the ground. You sometimes have a philosophical, like a country will say, philosophically we stand in this place. But actually the reality on the ground is there's a lot of work being done in different markets. There's very different infrastructure, whether you're in India, the US or China, and you have to work within that. We're very, very lucky that we've got teams on the ground that understand that and know the nuances. But you know what? There's a philosophical area that sometimes is posturing, but the reality on the ground, there's a lot happening.
Tony, I can see you want to come in. How can you bridge that gap?
Just very quickly, politicians say they need us for our money. They need us for something much more important, which is to popularize sustainable living, to popularize a sustainable planet. That's something politicians can't do. Even the British government, which I think is far ahead of many other global governments, where they really need business is to make this mainstream new consumer behavior. I think that's what these three are talking about today.
And reflecting. Huge body of evidence pointing in the same direction. Thank you so much. Tony, Yasmin, Warren, Laura, this has been today's CBI check-in with the conference, and there'll be another one same time tomorrow. Thanks for joining us.